We talked to three players who made day one of Worlds last year, and not only did they make day one of Worlds, but they were successful in day one and made it onto day two. So they're going to give you some tips and tricks and just talk about how day one of Worlds is different from a normal tournament. All right, we're here with Eric Gansman talking about day one of Worlds. So you want to tell everybody who you are and what's up?
Yeah, sure. Hey, I'm Eric Gansman. I'm from New York. I go to school in Indiana. I've been playing since 2011, but I started really getting super competitive in 2013. And I've gotten two Worlds invites last year and this year.
Okay. And so we're talking about day one of Worlds, and last year you made it through day one onto day two. And how did day one of Worlds last year compare to other big tournaments like regionals and things like that?
Um, Compared to regionals, I mean, it was kind of surreal because it was my first invite. I kind of I didn't expect to do well. I wasn't expecting to, have a super great run, especially after starting off 0-2. And then I won six in a row. So it really was a surreal experience for me. I kept on telling myself, as soon as you lose your next one, you're going to drop. You have nothing to lose for. Just play it out anyways. Like, you might as well see how many wins you can get and just prove it to yourself that you're not a bad player. And then I just won six in a row.
That's
So
awesome.
it really was surreal. I don't think everyone's Worlds run is going to be like that.
Right.
I think mine was kind of crazy, but especially since it was my first, it was just compared to regionals and nationals, it doesn't really compare.
Okay. Would you say it's I've heard people say it's more difficult because the average skill is just so much higher, and I've heard other people say it's easier because you don't have the top tier of players, the top 16, right? The very highest. So what would you say it's easier or harder than typical regionals?
Than a typical regional, probably harder just because even though you're playing against not the greatest players on day one, they're still better than the average player that you'll play at a regional. But I didn't play really that like the people that I played on day one weren't actually that very good. Even on day two, I didn't play that very many good people. Like I was pretty unimpressed with the quality of play at Worlds, but I didn't play that many like known players. So
Okay.
maybe I just got an easy schedule at Worlds. That's very possible.
Yeah.
But I mean, there shouldn't be an easy schedule at Worlds.
Right.
So yeah, well, I don't know. I was pretty disappointed last year at Worlds. The hardest opponent I played, in my opinion, was Jeremiah Williams. He played a really good set against me, but besides that, I was really unimpressed, especially on day one with my opponent's play. I played a couple other good players, but like overall, it was pretty poor.
Okay. And are there any? First of all, how far did you get day two? Were you top?
I got top 16.
Okay, you were top 16. That's what I thought. So, do you have any tips or anything that about how to approach this versus how to approach regional or international?
Well, I think you should approach Nats and Worlds probably the same. Just test a bunch, probably a month and a half before. Like, start testing as soon as you can. And just figure out what the best decks are and figure out what deck you really want to test and figure out like the matchups out. And usually the best deck is probably the best deck to play for Nats and Worlds. You usually just want to put yourself in the best position possible, unless you find a broken rogue and like you actually have legitimately good matchups and you think you're gonna everyone's sleeping on it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's better just to go meta and not really risk like trying to play like a tier 2 deck that beats like some games in the meta just by like trying to metagame people. I think it's probably just strongest. Just go with the strongest meta call. So that's what I did last year for Worlds. Nats, I just played Vesicle and Vileplume because my friend Harrison Lemon just gave it to me like the night before the tournament,
Yeah.
and I was doing that all last year, and I thought it was a good idea. But then I prepped a ton for Worlds last year. I figured out that I was going to play Night March probably like mid-July, and I just played that deck probably 500 games before Worlds, as many as I could, and just tested every single matchup and just learned the deck like perfectly. So I think that's why I ended up doing super well on day two, just because I knew everything that I could do. And I was just running like really well with the deck as well. Like I had a bunch of turn 189 marches, so I was definitely getting lucky there too.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But yeah, just figuring out like what deck you want to play and just identifying that. So that's what I'm in the process of doing currently. I'm just like figuring out what I think the strongest decks are in the format, and I'm just going to start picking those out soon and just testing them a bunch and figuring out like probably within the next couple of weeks what I'm going to play for Worlds. So
okay, and how do you think this year's day one is going to compare to last year's day one with fewer players making it?
Well, I think it's still probably going to be pretty easy. A lot of unqualified players, this sounds really elitist, but a lot of unqualified players ended up making Worlds via the championship point bump that really didn't have a shot at Worlds before that. I probably would have gotten my invite without it. I was like above 400 CP without cups, but anything can happen. But the bump definitely did help me, I guess, a little bit. It made me like not need to go to nationals, which was nice.
Yeah.
Because I didn't end up going to nationals. It was. I think the world's competition this year will probably be around the same level as last year because there still are some unqualified people.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, I could just hit a run of 6 really really tough opponents because there are some really good people in day one that didn't make day two just because the championship point bloodbath this year was absurd.
Yeah.
So it really all depends on who you end up playing. But I think there still are enough bad people in the tournament or lesser skilled, relatively lesser skilled top players in Worlds. So it's definitely possible to have an easy run like I did last year and just hit a lot of not subpar players. But again, we'll see. It all comes down to who we play. So.
Okay. And do you have any last tips or any shout outs that you want to do?
Last tips, again, really just figure out what the best decks in the meta are. I think that's really the best thing you can do going into Worlds. Don't get surprised. Test everything and figure out what the meta is going to be, at least in your own testing group. That's really important, I think, so you don't make a bad decision for Worlds, correctly identifying the strongest decks. And then I guess shout-outs to Hovercast TCG. It's a YouTube channel I run. I've been really busy with work, as has my partner Travis Nunlist. But we're definitely going to have some videos out for Worlds.
Great.
Maybe of us testing, hopefully. But definitely at least a roundtable or two.
Mm-hmm. I enjoy listening to those.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
And then follow me on Twitter at Eric Gansman TCG as well. And I guess that's probably it for shout-outs.
All right. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks.
All right. And we're here with Brandon Flowers, who made day 2 at Worlds last year after getting his invitation to day 1. He played through and made day 2. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep. Like he said, I'm Brandon Flowers. I got my invite last year, went through day 1 to get to day 2. And from there, just got actually top 16, which was kind of surprising, but was nice.
Awesome. Really nice. And so you sent me this. I'm going to pull up this document now. You sent me this document of Brandon sent us this document of all sort of standings after round 8 of day 1. And why don't you tell everybody what you were telling me earlier about this?
So I originally mentioned this just to show the contrast of structure from regionals to Worlds. Regionals, you have to have a certain record to move on to day 2. Worlds, you had to have X number of wins, which last year it was 6. People are predicting it'll be less this year, but last year you had to have 6 wins out of 8 rounds. So ties and losses counted the same, meaning they counted for nothing, because match points didn't actually have a direct effect on anything. So to move on to day 2, all you had to have is 6 wins. You could have 2 losses, 2 ties, whatever besides that. But once you get more than 2 non-wins, you don't advance at all.
Yeah, so last year, I didn't understand this until Brandon explained it to me. Last year, only wins and losses losses and ties were literally the same thing. You had to get 6 wins to go on. So you have all these people who drop because they had a combination of wins or losses and ties that were 3 or more.
Yeah, so 3 or more of anything that's not a win.
293 people dropped. I guess a few at the end dropped after losing round 1 for whatever reason, but that's really crazy. So besides the structure, in terms of skill level or in terms of difficulty, since you don't have the top 16 NA players, how does it compare in difficulty to regional?
In my opinion, I'd say it was easier than a regional simply because, like you mentioned, all the day two players aren't in day one. You have a lot more diversity, and you have a lot more people trying something new, whereas they'd go with comfort plays in a regional. Regional has more rounds, you have to be more consistent, and match points matter more. So you're not being as playful, I guess. You're being a little more you're being more conventional for a regional and more trying something new for Worlds, whereas you wouldn't in a regional as commonly.
Okay, and why do you have a reason why you think people do that? You mentioned it a bit there, but
I think it turned into a lot of like theoretical, this is the play for Worlds, so a lot of people are going to play this, so I'm going to play this that has a better matchup against the rest of the field. So people were like counter, 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 even more than a regionals. So I saw a lot of Waterbox, a lot of Sceptile, a lot of Greninja, simply because people were expecting Night March. And I think I played Night March maybe 2 of the 8 rounds day 1, and I didn't play it at all oh no, I played it once day 2 as well.
And what was your deck choice, and why did you play it?
I played Vespiquen Vileplume just because I knew it was really strong, and I knew, 1, a lot of people weren't expecting it because it's quote-unquote easily countered, and 2, if you go first, it doesn't matter how hard you're countered, you can usually get around it simply by item locking them out of the counter, and then they just can't reach it.
And so you advanced to day 2, and what did you play day 2? Did you play the same thing?
Yep, I played the same exact list day 2, no changes whatsoever.
And it worked for you. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So how do you expect this year to be different than last year at Worlds with the lower number of invites and stuff?
I think the lower number of invites will certainly change the structure so that it's going to be less rounds and you have to win less rounds to get there. So last year it was 8 rounds, you had to win 6. It might be 7 rounds, win 5 this year, or even less. Probably not less though, because they added that buffer for points, so a lot of people that might have missed it got their invite. And I think I've looked at the numbers, and it's roughly, I think, half across the board for each country of the number of players that made it this year versus last year.
Wow. Going back to your deck choice, and the format, because you have to get 6 wins, do you think playing a deck like Vespiquen Vileplume that's super aggressive and plays, normally takes less than 10 turns. Your first turn's pretty long, but
yeah.
Do you think playing an aggro or a deck that doesn't take long, since you can't tie, basically, do you think that's important and worth making a deck choice on?
I think either being able to play against ties and not go for a tie, or like you're saying, playing a deck that's aggressive and can finish quickly. Either one of those is fine. And then changing it up for day 2 even, maybe, because match points matter more day 2 than they do day 1.
So day 2 doesn't follow the same format?
No, day 2 cuts to a top 8 after play, and those top 8 continue to play. So day 2 last year, you can see somebody actually bubbled, because it's not strictly win-based day 2, it's point-based day 2, and resistance factors into that too. So somebody from Great Britain bubbled last year, and top 8 wasn't clean as a result. So you've got 18, 17, 17, 16. Not sure why it's showing 18 out of order here, but match point wise, it's 18, 17, 17, 16, 18, and then 16 all the way down.
Wow. So, last real question here. What's the play for Worlds then?
It's really hard to tell. A lot of people think it's Gardevoir. As a result, a lot of people are going to play Metagross. As a result, you're going to have people playing Volcanion. It's hugely triangular, and just you can counter one thing, but somebody else will counter your play.
Sounds like a lot of what you were talking about last year. Like people trying to counter everything. So then you just play like Mega Rayquaza or something that just pounds stuff and go.
Yeah, Greninja would be a good play if it didn't have a tendency to tie so often. Like, it's strong, but it's slow to set up.
Yeah, very slow to set up. All right, well, are there any shout-outs or Anything you want to give like that before we get off?
I guess shout out to Colton Day for taking a loss to an airline last year. If you look at the list there, he's actually near the bottom at 0-3, and he has an asterisk because he was late day one, and his round one loss was based on him being late because his flight came in late.
Wow, that's rough.
But shout out to him and just all my friends that supported me last year and tested with me, and tested a heck of a lot more last year than I did this year, and it definitely showed. I also help run a papercraft website called Paper Pokes, and it's all free, and you can download whatever and make it yourself if you wanted to. So for anyone who's into crafty things, that's a pretty good option as well.
All right, very cool. Thank you for your time and your insights.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, and we're here with Mike Fouchet, and just talking about Worlds day one. So you made it through day one last year?
Last year, since the 2 years that they've had this day one, day two invite, I've gotten a day one invite both years and made it through to day two both years, which I feel like I've been fortunate to do that. One of only a couple players to do that.
Okay, very cool. And how is it different than, say, a regional or something like that? How is this day one different than another big tournament?
Yeah. So in a lot of different ways, actually. First of all, the attendance is lower than a typical regionals. Even last year, when it had the most day one players ever, it was like 450 or something like that. That was still like a lot smaller than a regionals now. So you're gonna play more rounds in a regional, and you have to win more games at a regional in order to do well. So I think that's a really big difference. Obviously, the flip side of that is that almost all the players you play against at Worlds are going to be, good players because they have their invite. So I'm not exactly sure how that changes what deck you play at the tournament. But you definitely have to be more comfortable with whatever deck you play because you're going to be playing against better players, so there's less room for error, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So you have to play a lot more games with your deck. But I think you can be a little bit more risky with your deck choice too, because if you pick a deck that kind of has some more polar matchups, that gives you a bigger advantage than like in a smaller tournament where if you just play a consistent deck and you play against, on average worse opponents than you have a lot more room to outplay each other in close matchups.
Makes sense.
When you're playing at Worlds, it's like really nice to have a very positive matchup because the skill gap is so much smaller. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's awesome. And what did you play on those two tournaments?
Yeah, so 2 years ago I played Night March. That was kind of the first time. One of the first times that Night March was like a really viable deck was the Nationals Worlds format.
Okay.
Because Shaman and Trainer's Mail came out before that, they had just come out.
Right.
That was when you played it with like Mew EX and stuff. And it didn't do that well at Nationals that year because kind of like Toad did very well and whatnot. But going into Worlds, it was kind of like a sleeper pick, and it beat a lot of the best decks. It beat Rayquaza, which was pretty big, beat Mega Manetric, which was a really big deck at the time. It even could beat Toad Garb. Toad Bats is, obviously a very bad matchup, but it took a lot of very positive matchups, which is kind of what I was talking about, right? Like it's beats a lot of decks pretty soundly, and then takes like one hard loss to Toad Bats. So like one of the matches I lost was to a Toad deck, and one was to a mirror match. But everything else was kind of like piece of cake because I just hit good matchups. So that was 2 years ago. Last year I played the weird Vespiquen deck that Ross Cawthon got top 4 with. We had worked on it together. So it was like Vespiquen Octillery, baby Eviltalls, like a bunch of baby Eviltalls. So and that was again we're trying to hard counter Night March with that. Which and in this case, Night March was the best deck. It was the most played deck. So by playing this, we were kind of hedging our bets that we'd play against a ton of Night March decks. And I did play against. There was 8 rounds last year. I think I played against 3 on the first day, which is pretty significant, 3 or 4. Mm-hmm. And we had decent matchups across the board, taking like one pretty bad matchup in it was like the big basic decks like Darkrai or Yveltal, things like that, which weren't that popular, but so we were willing to take that pretty bad loss. So, and both times that strategy kind of worked out for me. I did practice a lot with both decks going into it, just because a lot of micro decisions, especially with battle compressor decks. Mm-hmm. And like I said, very small room for error against high caliber players.
Mm-hmm. So this year there are going to be fewer players.
Yeah.
How is this year going to compare to last year and the year before in terms of what the tournament is like?
I think trying to figure out what the metagame is going to be like is going to be very hard because of the new set and its impact, but also very important this year. I think more important than ever. In these bigger tournaments, you can kind of ride the variance and the expected decks more or less. Like, going into internationals with 1,300 players, kind of everybody expected there to be mostly Espeon and Zoroark, and then other decks follow like pretty decent amount of Decidueye, Drampagarb. Everybody kind of knew the breakdowns, and it played out slightly different, but more or less when you have more players, it kind of like conforms to the average a little bit more. And when we have this smaller population of whatever 100 something players, the metagame is not going to be so uniformly distributed. So figuring out what other people are playing, I think, is going to be of paramount importance at such a small tournament.
Yeah. So do you think do you think that affects your ability to play a rogue deck like you did last year? Well, sort of a rogue deck, like the Yvette will take on it in the Octillery.
Yeah. Maybe a little bit. Just because it's risky to play. It's risky to play a rogue deck that just takes a couple good matchups, hedging your bets against a more unknown metagame. Mm-hmm. I think last year the impact of Steam Siege was so minimal on the format that the metagame didn't really change too much. But this year I think it's going to change drastically from internationals, solely because of Gardevoir. Really, I mean, and some other cards, but like even just Gardevoir really just changes the format quite a lot. So. Yes, so I do think it'll be a lot harder, and I really have to rethink that strategy. And maybe you just go with something consistent that that can beat Gardevoir in a more unknown metagame. That's something I have to think about. I would love to be able to play a more rogue deck though, because I've written about this before. But if I have 2 decks that, like, let's say one's a known deck and one's a relatively unknown deck, and they have about the same matchups, and I think they have about the same chance of doing well in an event, I'll always pick the unknown deck, because there's also that variable of my opponents not having as much information and experience playing against that deck.
Mm-hmm. And how do you prepare? How are you testing for it?
Currently, the testing situation is a little awkward because it's not on PTCGO.
Right.
But I have been playing some games on PlayTCG with some friends, just using proxies. I met up with some friends in real life to play with some proxies, so that's been okay. But mostly, in terms of actual strategy of testing, I started with Gardevoir because I knew it was going to be the best. And nobody really knows what the best Gardevoir list is right now. Everybody's kind of testing some different things. Some people play Octillery, some don't. Some play Diancie, some don't. Some play Sylveon, some don't. Like, you could even just run it with like straight and Alolan Vulpix as a one-up, kind of like Metagross. But so like really, I think figuring out Guardy is like of paramount importance, and then kind of going from there. I've been messing around with Noivern decks. I'm really messing in the messing around phase, like experimenting with different things, trying to refine lists a little bit. Once by the time that the set becomes legal on PTCGO, I really hope to start testing matchups more.
Right.
But right now it's kind of just figuring out what the best list is
Yeah.
for this deck, and then you can kind of tweak it based on what you expect the metagame to look like.
And you think it's powerful enough that the metagame's gonna shape around it, around Gardevoir?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and Gardevoir, but you can also do this with like other decks too.
Right.
Like Volcanion's worth looking into. Drampagarb probably needs to change a little bit if it wants to stay. Espion's probably done, and so starting to do this with each deck and just kind of think about what it's going to look like in this new format. Decidueye still like needs to kind of reinvent itself maybe a little bit. So like that's kind of the phase that we're in until we actually see the cards and being able to test the matchups more what's the word I'm looking for? Easily.
Yeah. Last question: are there any tips that you have for people who are going into Worlds for the first time? There aren't very many of them.
Yeah, that's true. But there's probably a few, or at least like people that maybe are just going to their second Worlds or whatever. I mean, like the experience is unlike any other. It's like it's awesome to just play against people from around the world at the highest level. This year, I guess the internationals also had that experience too, which was really cool to actually experience for the first time. But just like chill, it can just be like any other tournament. Day one, you only have to go X2, whatever that is, 4-2, 5-2. I think it could be as little as 4-2 this year. So if you pick a deck that you're comfortable with and you practice with a lot, like it's taking 2 losses is, you can take 2 losses. Like no other tournament can you take 2 losses and still be there. So you've done it a bunch of times this year, you can do it again, right? If you're there, you deserve to be there, especially this year. If you got the invite, you're definitely meant to be there.
All right. Very cool. So do you have any shout outs or anything you want to give before we end?
Shout out to Six Prizes. I write for them, so check out my articles there. And I was actually on Super Rodcast earlier today, so check that episode out. Thank you for doing some more video content. It's always good to spread the love.
Yeah, thanks for helping me out.
Yeah, man.